The New Year's Bargain. There are moments in life when everything you thought you knew gets rewritten in a single heartbeat. For Tom Whitaker, that moment came on a freezing January morning when he found blood in the snow, leading to his front porch, and discovered the valley's most notorious wild lynx sitting on his dead wife's swing, waiting for him like an old friend. What happened next would break every rule of nature he'd learned in 72 years. Because Mara didn't run. She didn't attack. She did something far more impossible. She grabbed his pant leg with claws sharp enough to shred bone and pulled him toward the forest, toward a choice that would cost him his freedom, his safety, and maybe his sanity. But it would also give him back something he thought had died 3 winters ago, buried alongside the woman he loved. This is the story of what happens when grief meets grace in the most unexpected place. When a broken man and a desperate mother strike a bargain that neither of them could have survived alone. And when winter, that cruelest of seasons, decides to give back instead of take away. It all started with fireworks, blood, and the kind of silence that screams louder than any explosion. The silence after midnight hit harder than any explosion. Tom Whitaker stood at his kitchen window, coffee gone cold in his hand, staring at the mess scattered across his front yard. Bright plastic casings, charred paper tubes, and glittering shrapnel from last night's fireworks display covered the snow like confetti at a funeral. The Henderson family's annual New Year's extravaganza had spilled over his property line again. Their rented vacation mansion next door still dark and quiet in the gray January dawn. He hated New Year's Eve. Hated the forced joy, the manufactured countdown to nothing. 3 years ago, Sarah had been beside him when the clock struck 12. 2 years ago, her hospital bed had been wheeled past the nurse's station just as champagne corks popped down the hall. Last year, he'd sat in this same kitchen, alone, listening to distant celebrations that felt like mockery. Tom pulled on his work coat and grabbed the heavy-duty trash bag from under the sink. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as he stepped outside. The temperature had dropped to somewhere around 0, that bone-deep cold that made the snow squeak under his boots. He started picking up the debris piece by piece, each item a small act of reclaiming his space. A Roman candle tube, a spent sparkler, a champagne cork that had somehow traveled 50 yards from their deck to his azalea bushes. Then he saw the blood. It cut across the pristine white snow in an irregular line, bright red and fresh, leading from the pile of firecracker remains toward his front porch. Tom's chest tightened. He'd seen enough injured animals during his years with the fire department, enough wildlife hit by cars or caught in farm equipment. Blood on snow always looked worse than it was, but it also never lied about one thing. Something was hurt. He followed the trail slowly, counting the drops. Not a massive hemorrhage, but steady enough to matter. Whatever had bled here was still bleeding. The tracks were smudged, impossible to identify, dragged through the snow like something limping or crawling. Tom's mind shifted into the old familiar mode, the one that never quite left him even after retirement. Assess the situation, locate the victim, determine if rescue is possible or if mercy is kinder. He walked back to the house, opened the hall closet, and pulled out the rifle Sarah had always hated him keeping loaded. The blood trail ended at his porch steps, then seemed to vanish. Tom climbed slowly, rifle held low, safety still on. He scanned the wooden planks, the shadowed corners beneath the eaves, the dormant flower boxes Sarah had planted their first summer here. Nothing. Just old snow, undisturbed ice, and the ghost of wind chimes she'd hung that no longer rang. He was about to turn back when he heard it. Not a whimper or a cry. but something closer to a low, rattling breath. Coming from the far end of the porch, where the old swing bench sat frozen in place. Tom moved toward it, and his heart stopped. Sitting perfectly upright on Sarah's bench, as if waiting for a bus, was the lynx. Not just any lynx. Mara. The locals had been talking about her for years. The big female with the notched ear and the missing half-tail. The one who'd survived at least 3 harsh winters that should have killed her. Game wardens had tried to track her. Hunters had tried to bag her. Photographers had tried to capture her. She'd evaded them all with an almost supernatural cunning. And now she sat on his dead wife's swing, staring directly at him with eyes like molten gold. Tom raised the rifle instinctively, but something stopped him from flipping the safety off. The lynx wasn't crouched to pounce, wasn't hissing or laying her ears back. She was just sitting there, trembling violently, her thick winter coat unable to hide the shivers that ran through her entire body. "Get out of here," Tom said, his voice rough. He stamped his boot on the wooden boards. "Go on. Get." Mara didn't move. Those yellow eyes never blinked, never looked away. Tom could see the blood now, a matted patch on her right foreleg, dark against the silver-gray fur. "I said get." He raised his voice, took a step forward. That's when she moved. Not away, but toward him. In one fluid motion, she leapt down from the bench and crossed the space between them faster than Tom could process. He stumbled backward, the rifle swinging up. But before he could do anything, she'd done something that defied every natural law he understood. She grabbed his pant leg with her front claws and pulled. Not a swipe, not an attack. Her claws hooked into the thick denim of his jeans and tugged, yanking him toward the porch steps with surprising strength. Then she released, bounded down to the snow, and looked back at him, waiting. Tom stood frozen, his heart hammering against his ribs. In 40 years of dealing with wild animals, he'd never seen anything like this. Predators didn't make contact unless they were starving or rabid. They didn't grab you and pull. They didn't look at you with what could only be described as expectation. Mara turned and took 3 steps toward the tree line, then stopped, looked back. Her stub of a tail twitched once, twice. She took 3 more steps, stopped again. The pattern was unmistakable. She wanted him to follow. Tom looked down at his jeans, at the small tears her claws had left. Looked at the rifle in his hands, looked at the lynx waiting at the edge of his property, trembling in the cold, bleeding onto the snow. "I've officially lost my mind," he muttered to the empty air. But he followed anyway. The forest swallowed them within minutes. Tom had lived on the edge of these woods for 15 years, but he'd never ventured this deep in winter. The snow reached mid-calf in places, and the wind cut through his coat like it wasn't even there. Mara moved ahead with practiced ease, her wide paws distributing her weight across the surface, while Tom floundered behind, his breath coming in ragged clouds. She kept the same pattern. 3 bounds forward, pause, turn back to check if he was still following. Her eyes would lock onto his for just a moment before she continued. There was an urgency in her movements that felt almost human, a desperation that made Tom's chest ache with something he couldn't name. The rifle had become dead weight in his hands. He'd brought it on instinct, but he knew now he wouldn't use it. Whatever was happening here existed outside the normal rules. Predator and prey had somehow switched scripts, and Tom was too tired, too numb from 3 years of grief, to question it anymore. The wind picked up, driving snow into his face. Tom pulled his collar higher and pushed forward, following the gray shape that appeared and disappeared through the white curtain ahead. His toes were going numb, His fingers ached where they gripped the rifle. This was insane. He was a 72-year-old man chasing a wild lynx through a blizzard because she'd tugged on his pants. Sarah would have laughed herself sick. Mara stopped so suddenly that Tom nearly stumbled into her. She'd frozen in place, her body gone rigid, her head lowered toward the ground. A sound came from her throat, low and guttural, not quite a growl, but close enough to make Tom's hand tighten on the rifle. "What is it, girl?" The words came out before he could stop them, like she was a dog who might answer. She didn't move, just held that position, every muscle tensed, her stub tail straight out behind her. Tom stepped carefully to the side, trying to see what had caught her attention. Then he saw the trap. It was old, probably left over from when trappers still worked these woods legally. The steel jaws were half buried in snow, rust eating at the edges, but the spring mechanism looked intact. One more step and Tom's boot would have landed directly on the trigger plate. His heart kicked hard against his ribs. He looked at Mara, who had moved now, circling around the trap with exaggerated care before looking back at him. Waiting again. She had known. Somehow, she had known exactly where that trap was buried and had stopped him from walking into it. Tom felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the ice that had formed around his heart 3 winters ago. "Thanks," he whispered, and meant it. They walked for another 10 minutes, the forest growing denser, the light dimming even though it was only mid-morning. Tom's legs burned with exhaustion, and he was seriously considering turning back when the trees opened up into a clearing. And there, sitting like an obscene joke in the middle of the wilderness, was the Henderson mansion. Tom stopped, confused. He knew this place from the road, had driven past it 100 times. But he'd never approached it from the back, never seen it from this angle. The massive vacation home rose 3 stories high, all dark windows and locked doors. The Hendersons had left right after their fireworks show, back to wherever rich people went when they got bored of pretending to rough it. Mara didn't hesitate. She moved along the fence line until she found a gap, squeezed through, and headed straight for the side of the house. Tom followed, climbing awkwardly over the decorative stones the Hendersons had arranged along their property line. The lynx led him to the HVAC system, the heating and cooling unit that sat exposed on a concrete pad near the foundation. She stopped there, sat down heavily, and for the first time since this whole impossible journey started, she made a sound that wasn't a growl or a breath. She cried. It was high-pitched, desperate, the sound of an animal in pain that Tom had heard too many times in his career. But this wasn't physical pain. This was something deeper, something that made Tom drop to his knees in the snow beside her and finally understand. He looked at the HVAC unit, at the aluminum ducting that ran from it into the wall, at the external vent cover, which should have been blowing warm air but was instead covered in a thick layer of ice. He pressed his ear against the metal and heard it. Faint. So faint he almost missed it under the wind. A tiny, mewling cry from inside the frozen ductwork. Her kits were trapped inside. Tom understood now, and the understanding made him feel sick. Last night, while the Hendersons were lighting up the sky with their expensive fireworks, Mara's kits had been terrified. They were young, probably born late in the season, and the explosions would have sounded like the end of the world. So they'd done what any frightened animal would do. They'd found the warmest, safest place they could reach and hidden inside. The HVAC duct had been running all evening, pumping heat into the empty mansion while the family partied outside. To 3 scared babies, it must have felt like a perfect den. Warm, dark, enclosed. They'd crawled in through the external vent and settled deep inside the aluminum tunnel. Then, this morning, the Hendersons had packed up their champagne glasses and designer luggage and driven back to the city. They'd turned off the heat, locked the doors, and left. The temperature had dropped to 20 below. The condensation inside the ductwork had frozen solid, sealing the vent covers shut like a tomb. Tom ran his hands over the ice-covered grate, his fingers already going numb. He tried to pry it open, but the ice was thick as his thumb and hard as stone. He looked around for something to use as a lever, but there was nothing out here except snow and frozen decorative rocks. Mara paced back and forth, her movements frantic now. She'd scratch at the vent, then back away, then return to scratch again. The sound coming from inside had grown fainter. Time was running out, and they both knew it. "I can't get it open from out here," Tom said, more to himself than to the lynx. "The ice is too thick. I'd need to get inside. Take the whole duct apart from the basement." He looked up at the house, at the dark windows and locked doors. Then he looked at Mara, who had stopped pacing and was staring at him with those gold eyes that seemed to see straight through to his bones. Tom had spent 40 years following the rules. He'd been a firefighter, for God's sake. He'd respected property lines, obeyed no trespassing signs, filed his taxes on time. He'd been a good husband, a decent neighbor, a law-abiding citizen. And where had it gotten him? Standing alone in his kitchen every morning, drinking cold coffee and counting the ways his life had ended when Sarah's had. He stood up, his knees protesting, and walked toward the house. The basement windows were at ground level, half buried in decorative stone mulch. He chose one that looked like it led to a utility room, somewhere the Hendersons probably never went anyway. "This is the stupidest thing I've ever done," he muttered, raising the butt of his rifle. The window shattered with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the quiet forest. Tom used the rifle barrel to knock away the remaining shards, then lowered himself through the opening. His boots hit concrete, and he was inside. The basement was dark and cold, filled with the expensive junk that rich people accumulated and then forgot about. Tom pulled out his phone and turned on the flashlight. He needed to find the main HVAC access panel, probably near the furnace. He was halfway across the room when he heard it. A soft electronic beep, barely audible. Then another. Tom's blood went cold. The Hendersons had a security system. Of course they did. And he'd just triggered it. Most modern systems gave you 60 seconds to enter a code before calling the police. Tom figured he had maybe 30 seconds left. He could run, climb back out the window, disappear into the woods. But those kits would die. They might already be dying. He found the furnace room and yanked open the access panel. The ductwork snaked away into darkness, held in place by metal brackets and sheet metal screws. He needed a screwdriver, needed light, needed time he didn't have. Tom dropped to his knees and started working with his bare hands, trying to unscrew the brackets by sheer force. His fingers slipped, his knuckles scraped against sharp metal edges. The beeping had stopped, which meant the call had gone through. Sheriff's department would be here in 15 minutes, maybe less. He got the first bracket loose, then the second. The duct shifted, and he heard the crying again, louder now, more desperate. 3 distinct voices, high and thin and fading. "Hold on," Tom whispered into the darkness. "Just hold on." He'd gotten the third bracket free when headlights swept across the basement windows. Not 15 minutes, 5. Tom kept working, his hands shaking now, blood from his scraped knuckles making the metal slippery. The engine shut off outside. A car door opened and closed. Footsteps on the frozen ground, purposeful and quick. The fourth bracket came loose, and the entire section of duct pulled free. Tom grabbed it, felt the weight shift inside, heard the scrambling of tiny claws against aluminum. He was pulling it toward the light when the basement door at the top of the stairs crashed open. "Police, show yourself! Hands where I can see them!" Tom recognized that voice. Young, tense, trying to sound harder than he felt. Cade Morrison, sheriff's deputy, son of Tom's old friend Jack, dead now 5 years from cancer. Tom had known this kid since he was in diapers. But right now, Cade had a gun, and Tom was holding a piece of stolen ductwork in a house he'd broken into. He didn't put his hands up. Cade came down those stairs fast, his service weapon drawn, his flashlight beam cutting through the darkness like an accusation. He swept the room in textbook formation, the way they'd taught him at the academy, the way he'd practiced 1,000 times but never actually used. Then his light found Tom, kneeling on the concrete floor, hands wrapped around a section of aluminum ductwork, blood dripping from his knuckles onto the gray surface. "Tom?" Cade's voice cracked slightly. "What the hell are you doing?" "Put the gun down, Cade." Tom didn't look up, didn't let go of the duct. His voice was steady, almost calm. "I'm not a threat to you. You broke into the Henderson house. That makes you a criminal." Cade took another step down, his gun still raised but wavering now. "Put your hands on your head and lie face down on the floor, now." "Can't do that, son." "Tom, I swear to God, don't make me." "Listen to me." Tom finally looked up, and even in the harsh beam of Cade's flashlight, his eyes were clear and certain. "There are 3 baby lynx trapped inside this duct. They've been here since last night. No heat, no airflow. If I don't get them out in the next few minutes, they're going to die." Cade stopped moving. His gun stayed up, but his whole body had gone still in that particular way that meant he was actually listening. Tom knew that stillness. He'd seen it in Jack Morrison 100 times, that moment when a good man stopped reacting and started thinking. "You broke into a house to rescue wild animals?" "Their mother led me here. She's outside right now, waiting." "Tom, you're not making any sense. You sound crazy?" "Yeah, probably." Tom shifted his grip on the duct, feeling movement inside, hearing the faint cries that were getting weaker by the second. "But I'm also right. So either shoot me or help me, but make up your mind fast because I'm not stopping." For a long moment, neither man moved. Cade's finger rested on the trigger guard, not inside it, but close enough. His training said one thing, his heart, maybe, said another. Then a sound came from behind him, from the broken basement window. A low guttural warning that made the hair on the back of Tom's neck stand up, even though he'd been expecting it. Cade spun, his flashlight beam swinging toward the window. Mara stood there, half in and half out, her body filling the frame. In the artificial light, she looked enormous, otherworldly, her winter coat bristling and her lips pulled back to show teeth that could shred a man's throat in seconds. But she wasn't looking at Tom. She was looking at Cade, and she was moving forward, slow and deliberate, placing herself between the deputy and the old man on the floor. Jesus Christ. Cade's voice had gone tight with fear. His gun swung toward the lynx, his training taking over again. Wild animal, aggressive posture, threat to life. Eliminate the threat. "Don't you dare!" Tom's shout echoed in the concrete space. "Cade, don't you pull that trigger. Listen, just listen." Something in Tom's voice must have reached him, because Cade froze. His gun stayed up, his body stayed tense, but he didn't fire. And in that moment of terrible silence, they all heard it. The crying from inside the duct. Weak, desperate, unmistakable. Not one voice, but three, layered over each other like a broken cord. The sound that infant mammals make when they're dying. The sound that reaches into the most primitive part of the human brain and screams wrong. Fix this. Save them. Cade's gun lowered an inch, then another. His face had gone pale in the flashlight's backwash. How long have they been in there? Since last night. Maybe longer. Tom's hands were shaking now, adrenaline finally catching up with him. The heat was on when they crawled in. The Hendersons shut it off this morning. The condensation froze, sealed the vent. They're trapped. Cade holstered his weapon. Just like that, the deputy became something else. Someone else. He moved down the remaining stairs and crossed to where Tom knelt, pulling a multi-tool from his belt. Show me where the brackets are. They worked together in the dim light, Tom holding the duct steady while Cade used the screwdriver attachment to remove the remaining screws. Mara had backed away from the window, but stayed visible, her gold eyes reflecting the flashlight beam, watching every movement. The last screw came free, and the duct section separated completely. Tom laid it carefully on the floor and peered inside. Three shapes, barely visible in the darkness. Small bodies covered in soot and ice crystals, huddled together at the far end of the aluminum tunnel. Two of them were moving, just barely, their tiny flanks rising and falling in shallow, rapid breaths. The third one wasn't moving at all. Tom reached in carefully, his hands still shaking, and pulled out the first kit. It was a female, her fur matted and filthy, her eyes squeezed shut. But she was breathing, and when his warm hands closed around her, she let out a weak cry that sounded like hope. He handed her to Cade, who took her with surprising gentleness, cradling her against his chest. Tom reached in for the second one, another female, slightly larger, slightly stronger. She hissed at him, a pathetic sound that barely qualified as defiance, and he loved her for it. Then he reached for the third kit, the smallest one, and his heart sank. The runt was cold, not winter cold, but death cold. Her body was limp, her tiny mouth slightly open, her eyes dull and unseeing. Tom pulled her out and held her in his palm, this impossibly small creature that weighed less than a coffee mug, and felt something break open inside his chest. He'd been too late. Again. Tom stared at the tiny body in his palm, and for a moment he was somewhere else entirely. The back of an ambulance, Sarah's face gray under the oxygen mask, her hand gone cold in his, while the paramedic worked and nothing changed. The horrible stillness that came after the monitors went flat. The way time seemed to fold in on itself, the feeling of standing outside his own body watching his life end. Tom. Cade's voice cut through the memory. Is she? Get upstairs. Tom's voice came out rough. Find the bathroom. I need towels, a hairdryer if they have one, anything that generates heat. Tom, if she's already, move. The word came out like a gunshot, and Cade moved, carrying the two surviving kits up the stairs two at a time. Tom heard him running through the house above, doors opening and closing, the sound of cabinets being searched. Tom laid the runt on the concrete floor under the harsh beam of his dropped flashlight. Her chest wasn't moving. He pressed two fingers gently against her tiny ribcage and felt nothing. No heartbeat, no breath. Just the terrible absence that he knew too well. He looked toward the broken window. Mara stood there still, but she'd gone completely motionless. Her ears were flat, against her skull, her eyes fixed on the small body under Tom's hands. She knew. Animals always knew. But she didn't come closer. Didn't try to take her kit back. She just watched with an intensity that felt like judgment. Tom stripped off his gloves. His hands were shaking badly now, scraped and bloody and half frozen. But he needed to feel what he was doing. He'd taken a wilderness first aid course 20 years ago, back when he was still active with the department. They'd covered hypothermia, cardiac arrest, CPR on infants, but never on a lynx kit the size of his fist. He placed his thumb over the kit's chest, right where her heart should be, and pressed down gently. Her rib cage compressed under the pressure, fragile as a bird's. He released, pressed again, trying to find a rhythm. 30 compressions per minute for a human infant. Faster for something this small? He didn't know. He just kept going. Footsteps thundered down the stairs. Cade appeared with an armload of supplies, luxury towels that probably cost more than Tom's monthly grocery bill, and a professional-grade hairdryer still in its box. I found a bathroom upstairs. Plugged this in up there, got it running. Cade dropped to his knees beside Tom, unwrapping the towels. What do you need me to do? Take the other two, wrap them, warm them slowly. Not too fast, or their hearts will stop. Tom didn't look up, didn't stop the compressions. Go to the bathroom where there's power. Cade gathered the two survivors and disappeared again. Tom heard the hairdryer kick on upstairs, a low mechanical hum that meant at least 2 of the 3 would probably make it. He kept working on the runt. Compress, release, compress, release. His thumb was going numb, his wrist starting to ache. How long had it been? 2 minutes. 5? There was a window for this, he knew. A brief span of time when the brain could survive without oxygen, when death wasn't quite permanent yet. But he didn't know what that window was for a lynx. Didn't know if he'd already missed it. Come on, he whispered. Come on, little girl. Compress, release, compress, release. The motion became mechanical, automatic, his whole world narrowing down to this tiny creature and the rhythm of artificial life. His mind drifted again, and he was back in that ambulance, watching the paramedic do the same thing to Sarah, seeing the same terrible stillness, feeling the same crushing helplessness. Not this time. His voice cracked. You don't get to die this time. You hear me? You don't get to quit. He didn't know if he was talking to the kit or to Sarah or to himself. Maybe all 3. His vision blurred, and he realized he was crying, tears dripping onto the concrete beside the small body that refused to breathe. Compress, release. Compress, release. I wasn't good enough before. The words came out broken, raw. I couldn't save her, but I can save you. I can do this one thing right. Cade appeared at the top of the stairs, the hairdryer in his hand, his face pale. Tom, maybe you should... I'm not stopping. She's been gone too long. You need to... I said I'm not stopping. The shout echoed in the basement. Tom's thumb pressed down again, and this time he felt it. Just the smallest flutter under his finger, so faint he almost missed it. He froze, waiting, hardly daring to breathe himself. There. Again. A tiny movement in her chest, barely perceptible. Cade, bring that hairdryer down here, now. Cade came running, dragging the extension cord behind him. Tom scooped up the runt and held her close to his chest, one hand supporting her head, the other curved around her body. Cade turned the dryer on low and directed the warm air over her, careful not to get too close. The kit's body twitched, once, twice. Then her tiny mouth opened, and she made a sound like a paper bag crinkling, a weak attempt at a breath that wasn't quite successful. Come on, baby, Tom breathed. One more. Give me one more. She convulsed in his hands, her whole body shuddering. and then she coughed. It was the most beautiful sound Tom had ever heard. She coughed again, harder this time, and drew in a rattling breath that whistled in her tiny lungs. Her eyes cracked open, unfocused and cloudy, and she let out a cry so thin and weak it was barely audible. But it was there. She was there. Tom's legs gave out. He sat down hard on the cold concrete, still cradling the kid against his chest, while Cade kept the warm air flowing over both of them. Tears ran down Tom's face unchecked, dripping into his collar, and he didn't care. At the window, Mara made a sound Tom had never heard before, low and questioning, almost gentle. "She's okay," Tom called out, his voice thick. "Your baby's okay." And for the first time in 3 years, Tom Whitaker believed that maybe, just maybe, some things could be saved after all. They couldn't stay in the Henderson basement. That much was clear when Cade finally looked at his watch and realized they'd been there for almost an hour. The security company would have logged the alarm, probably called the Hendersons by now. Questions would come, reports would need to be filed. "We need to move," Cade said, already packing up the towels. "Can you carry them?" Tom nodded, too exhausted to speak. He'd wrapped all 3 kits in the stolen towels, their tiny bodies pressed together for warmth. The runt was sandwiched between her sisters, still breathing shallow, but breathing. That was enough. The hard part was Mara. She stood at the window, her whole body tense, watching Tom hold her babies. Every instinct she had must have been screaming at her to attack, to take them back, to trust nothing and no one. But she didn't move, just stood there trembling, her gold eyes locked on the bundle in Tom's arms. "We're taking them to my place," Tom said, speaking slowly, clearly, as if the lynx could understand English. Maybe she could, in her own way. "It's warm there. Safe. You can come too." Mara's ears swiveled forward, listening. Tom started walking toward the broken window, moving carefully so as not to jostle the kits. When he reached the opening, he stopped and waited, giving her a choice. Mara could take her babies back right now, carry them into the frozen forest, try to keep them alive in whatever den she'd been using. Or she could trust him. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then, slowly, she backed away from the window. Not running, just making space. Tom climbed out, Cade helping from behind, and started the long walk back through the woods. The storm had passed, leaving behind a brittle, crystalline cold that made every breath hurt. But Tom barely felt it. He was focused on the bundle against his chest, on the faint movements that told him all 3 kits were still alive. Mara followed at a distance, appearing and disappearing through the trees like a ghost. Tom could feel her presence even when he couldn't see her, that weight of attention that wild things carry. She was still deciding, still weighing whether this strange alliance was worth the risk. They reached Tom's house just as the sun was setting, painting the snow in shades of orange and gold. Tom's legs were shaking by then, his body finally acknowledging what he'd put it through. Cade had to help him up the porch steps. Inside, Tom went straight to the fireplace. He hadn't used it in months, hadn't seen the point of making a fire just for himself. But now he built one quickly, his hands remembering the motions from years of practice. Kindling, logs, careful arrangement. The flames caught and spread, filling the room with warmth and light. He laid the kits on Sarah's old rag rug, the one she'd braided herself from scraps of their worn-out clothes. The kits immediately huddled together, drawn to each other's warmth. The runt was in the middle again, her sisters' bodies helping keep her alive. Cade was on his phone, his voice low and official. Tom heard snatches of the conversation. False alarm, malfunctioning sensor. No sign of intrusion. The lies came easily to the young deputy, and Tom felt a pang of guilt for putting him in this position, but not enough to regret it. "We're clear," Cade said, hanging up. "But I need to go back, file a report, make this official. You going to be okay here?" Tom nodded. "Thank you, Cade, for everything." "Don't thank me yet. I just committed about 6 different violations of protocol." But Cade was smiling slightly as he said it. "You need anything? Food? Supplies?" "I'll manage." After Cade left, Tom sat on the floor beside the kits, watching them breathe. Their fur was starting to dry, revealing the beautiful spotted pattern beneath the soot and grime. They were probably 6 or 7 weeks old, still dependent on their mother, but old enough to have some chance of survival. That's when he noticed the broken window. Not one of his own, but a presence in it. Mara had climbed onto the porch and was peering through the glass, her nose pressed against the cold pane. Tom stood slowly and walked to the door. He opened it, then stepped back. An invitation. Mara didn't come in right away. She stood at the threshold, every muscle coiled tight, ready to bolt. Tom could see the war happening inside her, generations of instinct screaming danger against the immediate need to be with her kits. Then one of the babies cried out, a thin sound of distress, and Mara's resolve broke. She slipped through the door like liquid shadow, so fast Tom barely saw her move, and crossed directly to her babies. She circled them once, sniffing each one carefully, then settled down beside them on the rug. Tom watched from across the room, hardly daring to breathe. Mara lay on her side, and the kits immediately began nursing, their tiny paws kneading her belly. She groomed them methodically, her rough tongue cleaning away the last of the soot and ice, restoring them to themselves. When she finished, she looked directly at Tom, not with suspicion or fear, but with something that might have been understanding, or maybe just exhaustion. Her eyes closed, her breathing deepened, and within minutes she was asleep. Tom sat in Sarah's old armchair, the one that still smelled faintly of her lavender soap if he pressed his face into the cushion. He watched the fire burn and the strange family sleep and felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up on a frozen river. Around midnight, Cade came back. He let himself in quietly, carrying a bag from the general store. Canned cat food, powdered milk formula, a heating pad still in its packaging. He set them on the kitchen counter without a word. "You should have gone home," Tom said softly. "Probably." Cade pulled up the ottoman and sat down, his eyes on the sleeping animals. "But I'm not sure I'd believe any of this tomorrow if I left now." They sat in silence, 2 men and a wild mother and her 3 babies, all of them refugees from the cold in their own way. The fire crackled and popped, throwing shadows on the walls. Outside, the temperature continued to drop. But inside Tom's cabin, something like warmth was beginning to take hold. Mara's ear twitched in her sleep. The runt, pressed against her mother's belly, let out a tiny sigh. And Tom, for the first time in 3 years, allowed himself to hope that maybe tomorrow would come after all. Dawn came slowly, the sun struggling to break through the heavy clouds that had settled over the valley overnight. Tom woke in his chair, his neck stiff and his back aching, and for a confused moment couldn't remember why he hadn't slept in his bed. Then he saw them. Still there, still real. Mara lay curled on the rug with her kits tucked against her belly, all 4 of them breathing in synchronized rhythm. The fire had burned down to embers, but the room still held its warmth. Cade was gone. He'd left a note on the kitchen counter in his careful handwriting. Had to go handle the report. Don't do anything else illegal today. Tom smiled despite himself. He moved quietly to the fireplace and added another log, trying not to disturb the sleeping family. But Mara's eyes opened immediately, tracking his every movement. She didn't get up, didn't tense, just watched, learning him, deciding still whether he was safe. The kits were stirring now, mewing softly as they woke. They nursed again, their tiny tails flicking back and forth. And Tom felt that strange tightness in his chest that he'd thought he'd lost forever. The simple witnessing of life continuing. It shouldn't have meant so much, but it did. He made coffee and stood at the window, looking out at the transformed landscape. The storm had left everything clean and white, erasing the debris from New Year's Eve, covering the scars. It was the kind of morning Sarah would have loved, the kind where she'd make him come outside and take a walk, even though he'd complain about the cold. Behind him, he heard movement. Mara had stood up, was stretching each leg carefully, working out the stiffness from a night spent on the floor. The kits tumbled over each other, playing now, their fear from yesterday replaced by the resilient joy that young things carry. Mara walked to the door and sat down, looking back at Tom. The message was clear. It was time to go. Tom's heart sank, though he'd known this moment was coming. Wild things don't stay. That was their nature, their survival. Mara had used him for what she needed, and now that need was past. He opened the door. The cold air rushed in, sharp and clean. Mara walked out onto the porch, then turned and called to her kits. It wasn't the harsh warning cry from yesterday, but something softer, maternal. A sound that meant, follow me, trust me, we're going home. The two larger kits bounded toward her immediately, their young legs clumsy but eager. They tumbled down the porch steps and into the snow, already beginning to play again, batting at each other with oversized paws. But the runt hung back. She sat at the threshold, looking from Tom to her mother and back again, her tiny face confused. She was the weakest, the one who'd come closest to dying. Maybe she remembered the warmth of Tom's hands, the rhythm of his heartbeat under her small body. Maybe she remembered being saved. Mara called again, more insistent this time. The runt took a hesitant step toward the door, then stopped. She looked up at Tom with those unfocused kitten eyes, and something passed between them that had no name in any human language. Then Mara did something that would stay with Tom for the rest of his life. She walked back up the porch steps, picked up the runt gently in her mouth, and carried her over to where Tom stood. She set the kit down at his feet, right on top of his worn boot, and looked up at him. Their eyes met, gold to gray, predator to prey, mother to the man who'd saved her children. Mara nudged the runt toward Tom with her nose. Once, twice. A deliberate gesture. Then she picked up her smallest daughter again and carried her down to join her sisters. Tom stood frozen, trying to understand what had just happened. It wasn't abandonment. Mara was taking all three kits with her, leading them toward the tree line where the forest waited. But that moment, that gesture of placing the runt at his feet, had been something else entirely. Acknowledgement, gratitude, a debt recognized between species that normally only met in violence or fear. Mara reached the edge of the woods and paused. She set the runt down and climbed onto a large boulder that jutted from the snow, her favorite lookout point that Tom had seen her use 100 times over the years. From there she could see everything: the valley, the cabin, the man standing on the porch. She looked back one last time, not at the house, but at him. Tom raised his hand, A small gesture, probably meaningless to her. But he needed to make it anyway. Then Mara and her 3 daughters disappeared into the forest, becoming part of the shadows and the snow and the wild places where humans don't belong. Tom stood on the porch for a long time after they'd gone, the cold seeping through his clothes, his coffee cooling in his hand. The sun had finally broken through the clouds, sending shafts of light across the pristine snow. He looked down at the yard and realized he couldn't see the firecracker debris anymore. The storm had buried it all, given him a clean slate. He thought about Sarah, about how she used to say that winter was just spring waiting to happen. He'd always thought that was nonsense, pretty words that didn't mean anything. But standing here now, watching the place where Mara had vanished, he started to understand. Winter took things away. That was its job, its purpose. It was supposed to be cruel, supposed to strip everything down to bone and ice and silence. But sometimes, if you survived it, if you made it through to the other side, winter gave something back. Not what you'd lost, never that. But something new, something unexpected. A reason to open your eyes in the morning, a reason to keep the door unlocked. Tom went inside and added another log to the fire, even though he was the only one there to enjoy it. He sat in Sarah's chair and drank his coffee while it was still hot. Outside, the sun climbed higher, melting the icicles on the eaves, and somewhere in the forest, a mother lynx was teaching her 3 daughters how to survive. And for the first time in 3 years, Tom Whitaker understood that he was still alive, and that maybe, just maybe, that was enough. The days that followed moved differently for Tom. Not faster or slower, just different. Like someone had adjusted the rhythm of time itself while he wasn't paying attention. He found himself waking earlier, standing at the kitchen window with his coffee while the sun came up, scanning the tree line for movement that rarely came. Mara and her kits were out there somewhere, denned up in some hidden place, living the way wild things were supposed to live. He knew better than to expect to see them again, but knowing didn't stop him from looking. Cade came by on the 3rd day, ostensibly to check on how Tom was doing, but really, Tom suspected, to make sure the old man hadn't completely lost his mind. They sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee that Tom had actually remembered to make fresh this time. Henderson called the station. Cade said, wrapping his hands around the mug. Wanted to know why his security system went off. Tom's stomach tightened. What did you tell him? That we responded to the alarm, found a window broken by a fallen branch in the storm, and secured the property. He thanked me for my diligence. Cade smiled slightly. Didn't even ask about the missing towels. I'll replace them. Don't bother. Those people have more money than sense. Cade took a long sip of coffee. You know what the weird thing is? I've been a deputy for 4 years, written up dozens of break-ins, theft reports, vandalism cases. This is the first time I've ever lied in an official report. I'm sorry I put you in that position. Are you? Cade looked at him steadily. Because I'm not. For the first time since I put on this badge, I feel like I actually protected something that mattered. They sat in comfortable silence after that. Tom thought about all the times he'd responded to calls during his firefighting years, all the times the rules and protocols had gotten in the way of doing what was actually right. Sometimes the system worked. Sometimes it didn't. You learned to tell the difference. That night, Tom couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about the runt, about how her tiny body had felt in his hands, cold and lifeless, and then suddenly, miraculously, not. He remembered the moment her heart had started beating again under his thumb. that flutter of life returning from wherever it had gone. It reminded him of something, a memory he'd been avoiding for 3 years. The last conversation he'd had with Sarah, in the hospital room that smelled like disinfectant and dying flowers. She'd been so weak by then, her voice barely a whisper, but she'd grabbed his hand with surprising strength. "Promise me something," she'd said. "Anything. Promise me you won't turn into one of those bitter old men who just waits to die." Tom had tried to laugh it off, told her she was being dramatic, that she was going to be fine. But Sarah had always been able to see through him, even at the end. Especially at the end. "I mean it, Tom. When I'm gone, you have to keep living. Not just breathing, but actually living. Promise me." He'd promised. And then he'd spent 3 years breaking that promise, one cold morning at a time. Tom got out of bed and walked to the window. The moon was nearly full, painting the snow in shades of silver and blue. And there, at the edge of the clearing, was a shape that made his breath catch. Mara stood perfectly still, her coat gleaming in the moonlight. She was alone, her kits presumably safe in whatever den she'd chosen. She wasn't looking at the house, but past it, toward something Tom couldn't see. Her posture was alert, but not tense. And Tom realized he was witnessing something private. A moment of stillness that wild creatures probably experienced all the time, but humans almost never got to see. He didn't move, didn't reach for his phone to take a picture or make any sound that might startle her. He just watched this shared moment of insomnia between 2 survivors of a Montana winter. After a while, Mara's head turned. Not toward the house, exactly, but close enough that Tom knew she was aware of him standing there. She held that position for several heartbeats, and Tom felt that same strange connection from before. That recognition between 2 beings who'd faced death together and come out the other side. Then she turned and melted back into the forest, silent as smoke. Tom stayed at the window long after she'd gone, thinking about promises and second chances and the mysterious ways that life sometimes forced its way back in when you'd given up on it entirely. He thought about Sarah's face when she'd made him promise to keep living, the fierce love in her eyes even as her body was failing. And he thought about the runt, that impossibly small creature whose heart had stopped and then started again under his desperate hands. How he'd begged her not to die, not to quit, as if his wanting it badly enough could make it true. And somehow, impossibly, it had worked. Maybe that was the secret Sarah had been trying to tell him. That love wasn't about holding on to what you'd lost. It was about being willing to fight for what was still here, still breathing, still trying. Even when the odds were impossible. Even when your hands were shaking and your heart was broken and you didn't think you had anything left to give. Especially then. Tom went back to bed and slept better than he had in months. He dreamed about spring, about snow melting and green things pushing up through the earth, about 3 young lynx learning to hunt in the lengthening days. And when he woke up the next morning, the sun was shining and his coffee was hot, and he realized he was looking forward to the day ahead instead of just enduring it. It wasn't much, but it was something. And for now, something was enough. February arrived with a thaw that nobody expected. The temperature climbed into the 40s, and the snow began its slow retreat from the valley, revealing the brown grass and mud underneath. Tom spent his mornings clearing the meltwater channels around his foundation. Work that Sarah used to nag him about and that he'd ignored for 3 winters running. It felt good to be useful again. To have a reason to go outside that wasn't just collecting firewood or checking the mail. Cade had started, stopping by regularly, usually in the evenings after his shift ended. They'd fallen into an easy routine, sitting on the porch if the weather allowed, drinking coffee or sometimes something stronger, not talking much, but comfortable in the silence. Tom hadn't realized how starved he'd been for human company until he had it again. "My sergeant asked about you yesterday," Cade said one evening, his boots propped on the porch railing. "Wanted to know why I kept driving out this way on my breaks." "What did you tell him?" "That I was checking on a lonely old man who breaks into rich people's houses." Cade grinned. He laughed, thought I was joking. Tom smiled despite himself. "Your father would have gotten a kick out of all this. Dad would have done the same thing you did." Cade's expression grew serious. "He always said the badge was supposed to serve people, not the other way around. I think I forgot that for a while." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last light fade from the sky. Tom was about to suggest they move inside when Cade suddenly sat up straight, his hand instinctively moving toward his hip where his service weapon usually sat. "Tom, look." At the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the twilight, were 4 shapes. Mara and her 3 kits, no longer tiny but still obviously young, their legs too long for their bodies and their movements clumsy with adolescent enthusiasm. Tom's heart jumped. He hadn't seen them since that morning in January when Mara had led them back into the forest. He'd wondered, late at night, whether they'd survived, whether the runt had made it through the worst of winter, whether Mara had found enough food to keep her milk coming. Now he had his answer. The kits were playing, tumbling over each other in the snow, while Mara sat watching them with that particular stillness that mothers everywhere recognize. Vigilant but relaxed, present but allowing them their independence. Tom could pick out the runt immediately. She was still the smallest, still moved with a slight hesitation that her sisters didn't have. But she was alive. And more than that, she was thriving. Her coat had filled out, glossy and thick. And when she pounced on one of her sisters, there was real strength in the movement. "They made it," Cade whispered, as if speaking too loud might shatter the moment. "All of them made it." Tom couldn't speak. His throat had closed up with emotion he couldn't name. Relief, yes. Joy, certainly. But something deeper, too. Something that felt like witnessing a promise kept. Mara's head turned toward the porch. In the fading light, her eyes caught and reflected the lamp from Tom's window. 2 golden coins floating in the darkness. She looked directly at him, and Tom felt the weight of that gaze settle over him like a benediction. Then she made a sound, low and soft, and the kits immediately stopped playing. They gathered around her, and she led them along the tree line, not into the forest, but parallel to it, letting Tom watch, letting him see what his intervention had saved. The runt was the last to follow. She stopped and looked back at the cabin, her young face curious, perhaps remembering something she couldn't quite place. A warmth, a heartbeat, hands that had refused to let her go. Mara called again, and the kit bounded after her family, disappearing into the shadows. Tom and Cade sat in stunned silence long after they'd gone. Finally, Cade let out a long breath. "Did that really just happen?" "I think so." "She came back. She brought them back to show you." Tom nodded, not trusting his voice. Because that's exactly what Mara had done. She hadn't needed to come here, hadn't needed to expose her kits to human presence. The forest was vast, and she could have avoided Tom's property entirely. But she'd chosen to come, chosen to let him see. Wild animals didn't say thank you. They didn't understand gratitude the way humans did, but they understood debt. They understood survival. And in her own way, Mara had just closed the loop on what had started that terrible morning after New Year's. "You know what the crazy thing is?" Cade said quietly. "Before that night in the Henderson basement, I was thinking about quitting. The job, I mean. Dad always made it seem noble, you know? Protecting and serving. But all I ever did was write speeding tickets and break up bar fights. I thought I'd made a mistake choosing this life. And now I know what Dad meant. It's not about the badge or the uniform or the regulations. It's about showing up when something matters, even when it's messy, even when you have to break a few rules." Cade looked at Tom. "You taught me that." "I didn't teach you anything. I just followed a crazy lynx into a blizzard." "No. You chose to care when it would have been easier not to. That's the difference between just existing and actually living." Tom thought about Sarah's words in the hospital, her fierce insistence that he keep living after she was gone. He thought about how he'd failed that promise for 3 long years, and how a wild creature with notched ears and a stubbed tail had somehow dragged him back from that edge. "Your father was a good man," Tom said finally. "He'd be proud of you." "Yeah, well, I'm trying." Cade stood up, stretching. "I should get going. Early shift tomorrow." After Cade left, Tom stayed on the porch, wrapped in his heavy coat, watching the stars come out. The temperature was dropping again, winter reasserting itself. But spring was coming. You could feel it in the air, that subtle shift that happened in late February when the light began to change, and the frozen earth started thinking about waking up. Tom thought about the runt, about how she'd looked back at his cabin before following her family into the wild, about how she carried his handprint on her life in ways she'd never understand, about how sometimes the things we save end up saving us right back. He stood up finally, his joints stiff from the cold, and went inside. The fire was still burning. Sarah's rag rug still lay in front of the hearth, and for the first time since she'd died, Tom looked at these familiar things and felt something other than grief. He felt gratitude for the time they'd had together, for the home they'd built, for the way she'd known him well enough to make him promise to keep living, even when he couldn't imagine how. Tom added another log to the fire and settled into her chair, and somewhere in the forest, a mother lynx was teaching her 3 daughters how to hunt, and the smallest one was learning that she was stronger than she looked. Spring came late to Montana that year, but when it finally arrived, it came all at once. The snow retreated in a rush, revealing a landscape Tom had almost forgotten existed. Green things pushed up through the mud, stubborn and insistent, refusing to be denied their season. Tom stood in his garden for the first time in 4 years, turning over the soil that Sarah had once tended with such care. His hands remembered the work, even if his heart had forgotten why it mattered. But he was remembering now, slowly, one morning at a time. He'd planted tomatoes yesterday. Sarah's favorite variety, the ones she used to slice thick for sandwiches all summer long. He knew he'd never taste them without thinking of her. But that was okay. The grief wasn't gone, would probably never be completely gone. But it had changed shape. Become something he could carry, instead of something that crushed him. It was mid-March when Mara came for the last time. Tom saw her from the kitchen window, standing at the tree line in the early morning light. She was alone, and something about her posture made Tom's chest tighten. She looked older somehow, though only 2 months had passed. The winter had been hard on her in ways that showed now that her thick coat was beginning to shed. Tom grabbed his jacket and went outside. The air was crisp, but no longer cruel. carrying the scent of wet earth and new growth. Mara didn't move as he approached, just watched him with those golden eyes that had seen so much. "Where are your girls?" Tom asked softly, knowing she couldn't answer, but needing to speak anyway. Mara turned her head toward the forest, and Tom understood. They were out there, learning to be independent, preparing for the day when they'd have to survive on their own. It was the way of things. Mothers taught and then let go, trusting that they'd done enough. Tom stopped about 20 feet away, respecting the invisible boundary that had always existed between them. Close enough to see the new scars on her muzzle, the gray beginning to show around her eyes. Close enough to remember the desperate journey through the blizzard. The moment she'd grabbed his pant leg and pulled him into a story he never could have imagined. Then Mara did something she'd never done before. She walked toward him, closing the distance Tom had left, until she stood less than 6 feet away. Close enough that he could see the individual whiskers on her face, the pattern of spots on her chest, the old wound on her ear that had given her that distinctive notch. She sat down, her tail curled around her feet, and looked at him. Not with wariness or calculation, but with something that felt almost like recognition. Like she was seeing him, really seeing him, and acknowledging what had passed between them. Tom's throat tightened. He wanted to reach out, to touch her, to feel the reality of her presence one last time. But he kept his hands at his sides. Some distances were meant to be maintained. Some wild things were meant to stay wild. "Thank you," Tom said, his voice rough with emotion he didn't try to hide. "For trusting me, for letting me be part of your story." Mara blinked slowly, a gesture that cat owners everywhere would recognize as affection or trust or maybe just acknowledgement. Then she stood, turned, and walked back toward the forest with that fluid grace that made her seem like she was part of the landscape itself. But before she disappeared completely, she stopped, looked back one final time, and Tom understood that this was goodbye. Not just for today, but forever. The kits were grown enough now that Mara would be ranging farther, hunting in territories she hadn't visited in years. Their paths might never cross again. Tom raised his hand in a small wave, feeling foolish, but needing the gesture anyway. Mara held his gaze for one more heartbeat, then turned and vanished into the greening forest. Tom stood there for a long time, watching the place where she'd been. The sun climbed higher, warming his face, and birds called from the trees that were just beginning to bud. The world was waking up, shaking off winter's grip, and Tom realized he was waking up too. He thought about New Year's Day, about standing in his yard, picking up firecracker debris and hating everything the holiday represented. About how the blood in the snow had looked like an ending but had actually been a beginning. About how sometimes the worst moments contain the seeds of salvation if you're brave enough or desperate enough or just plain stubborn enough to follow them. Tom walked back to his cabin. But instead of going inside, he sat on the porch steps where Sarah used to sit with her morning coffee. He looked at the garden he'd started, at the trees budding along the property line, at the mountains in the distance still wearing their caps of snow. For 3 years, he'd been waiting to die. Not actively, not suicidally, just passively letting the days pile up like snow until they buried him completely. He'd thought that was what grief was supposed to look like, that loyalty to Sarah meant refusing to move forward without her. But she'd known better. She'd made him promise to keep living because she understood something he'd forgotten. That life doesn't ask permission. It just keeps showing up, day after stubborn day, demanding to be acknowledged, demanding to be met with something other than refusal. Tom thought about the runt, about her tiny heart stopping and starting again under his desperate hands. about how close she'd come to giving up, and how his refusal to let her go had made the difference. About how sometimes survival is a choice you make minute by minute, breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. He wasn't sure when he'd started living again. Maybe it was the moment Mara grabbed his pant leg. Maybe it was when he chose to follow her into the blizzard. Maybe it was when he'd whispered to a dying Kit that she didn't get to quit, and realized he was talking to himself. Or maybe it had been happening all along, so slowly he hadn't noticed. Like spring arriving, like ice melting, like seeds pushing up through frozen ground, because that's what seeds do. They don't ask if it's safe, or if it's time, or if the world is ready for them. They just reach toward the light and hope for the best. Tom stood up, his knees protesting, but not as badly as they used to. He had work to do. More garden to plant, a deck that needed staining. Cade was coming for dinner tomorrow, and Tom had promised to teach him how to make Sarah's famous chili, the recipe she'd perfected over 40 years of marriage. He looked one more time at the tree line, at the place where wild things lived their secret lives, and smiled. Somewhere out there, 3 young lynx were learning to hunt. The smallest one, the one who died and come back, was probably still struggling to keep up with her sisters. But she'd make it. Tom knew she would. Because survival wasn't about being the biggest or the strongest or the fastest. It was about being stubborn enough to keep breathing when everything hurt. It was about accepting help when it was offered, even from the most unlikely sources. It was about understanding that winter always ended, even when you couldn't imagine how, and that spring would come whether you were ready for it or not. Tom went inside and started the coffee. Fresh grounds, hot water, the rich smell filling the kitchen like a prayer. Outside, the sun climbed higher and the snow kept melting, and the world kept turning, indifferent to human grief, but somehow, mysteriously, shot through with grace for those who paid attention. He poured himself a cup and stood at the window, watching the light paint new colors across the valley. And for the first time in 3 years, when Tom Whitaker thought about tomorrow, he didn't feel dread or emptiness or the crushing weight of days stretching endlessly ahead. He felt something that might have been hope, or maybe just curiosity about what came next. And for now, that was more than enough. Tom's story didn't end that spring morning. It began there. Because sometimes the hardest part isn't surviving winter. It's finding the courage to believe in spring again. If this story touched your heart, I'd love to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter that changed your life? Maybe it was an animal, a stranger, or just a moment that made you see things differently. Share your story with us. This community is built on the connections we make with each other. And if you'd like to hear more stories like Tom and Mara's, stories about second chances, unlikely friendships, and the quiet moments that remind us why life is worth living, please subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell. Every week, I bring you true stories of courage, compassion, and the bonds that connect us all, whether we walk on 2 legs or 4. Thank you for spending this time with me today. Until next time, remember, it's never too late to open your door to tomorrow. Take care, and I'll see you in the next story.